quick introduction, and then I'll turn it over to Nicole. So I want to welcome everyone to Serving Conservative Children, Tweens, and Teens today. My name is Charlie Taylor. I'm one of the continuing education consultants at KDLA. I'm facilitating today's webinar. Our presenter for today is Nicole Jenks May, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to her at this point. Please go ahead and feel free to chat in questions, comments, and any technical issues that you have during today's webinar. I'll be on monitoring to assist you with that. So I'll mute myself, and you can take it away, Nicole.
All right, thanks very much. I'll go ahead and move the polls over. As you can see that I know a little bit more about you all now. So I can see that in general you're comfortable with the idea of talking about religion. You have a lot of conservative people in your community perhaps. And let me move this pod up so you can see. There we go. It's feeling crabby. My background is kind of varied. I started out in teaching. I went to law school, decided I wasn't going to be a lawyer, went to library school, and then they convinced me to keep working on toward my PhD. So I've got a background in library, education, and a little bit of law, but I never practiced. So I'm interested in policy ideas, and that's where the ideas of this kind of presentation came from. In my teaching background, I worked at a Catholic school in Milwaukee, and if you know about Milwaukee, you know we have urban school choice. So it was a school that served poor children in the inner city who on public dollars, and it focused on urban Latinas. So we were bilingual, bicultural, and Catholic. And so we got a wide variety of people who went just because it had good test scores. When I did my master's in library and information science, I went back to the school to look at their reading program since they had such a strong one to see what the roots were of it. And one of the things that came up from a few of my students who had graduated, they're in their 20s now, a couple of them went on to become teachers, and they were concerned about the lack of culturally relevant materials because they'd gone to teacher school, they learned the lingo and learned that you're supposed to talk about culturally relevant materials. In other words, there weren't enough books about Latinas, and this is in the early 2000s. And I asked one of my students, I said, would you have read culturally relevant books if they had been there? And she had to think about it for a little bit, and this was a voracious reader. She read just about anything I brought in the classroom, and a lot of the things she loved happened to be books that I loved from the 80s or even from the 70s. And she said no, she wouldn't have read them. And I said, really? She said, well, the thing is, in the early 2000s, if you wanted to read a book about a Latina, you had to read about a gangbanger or a migrant farmer. Those weren't my reality. My reality was I went to a Catholic school, and I lived in an urban area, but I was still playing with dolls pretty much. So in her reality, the teen literature from my youth was actually more relevant to her than the teen literature that was available for her based on her ethnic background. And today it's gotten better, but maybe not a lot better. So this is surprisingly a very relevant topic even now, where we're talking about trying to increase diversity of literature, and we're adding more and more things. But one group that sometimes gets left out is the group that we assume has already been taken care of, and it may not fully be taken care of. When I had some ideas about this generating in my head, I was talking with my Orthodox Jewish friends and my Muslim friends, and they were saying, you know, we actually have the same problem. There are certain things that are in the literature that we don't want our kids to read either, and we actually have a common problem. So I realized that maybe the issue was that librarians were starting to worry that they were catering too much to the conservative Christian population, not realizing that by ignoring their needs, they were actually ignoring the needs of Muslims, of Jews, of other people as well. So that's kind of where the roots came in, is that there are some common issues that may crop up, and you may have already run into them in your own libraries. What are they, and what can we do about them? So let me move ahead. So our goal here is to try to figure out how to help you help your community. You're going to learn some strategies for slowing down teens and tweens so they can feel like the young adult sections actually do belong to them. We were talking about that at the beginning in the chat. It is very common in religious families to go into the children's room and then skip straight to Jane Austen. There's nothing in between. And so what do we do to slow them down? There are a lot of materials that actually meet their needs in the young adult section. They just don't know where they are or how to find them. You'll learn about conducting book clubs and discussions that are sensitive to the needs of conservative kids and teens. And you can pass these ideas on to the teachers in your community who probably have similar concerns. And finally, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions and hear suggestions for working with families in this sometimes multiply diverse demographic. And that's really a key problem, is that it is often multiply diverse. There's an idea that, well, if they're conservative, they must be all white Christians, and not necessarily. And that's part of what the struggle is. So here are some big disclaimers. I always add disclaimers when I talk about a group in a presentation. I'm a teacher librarian, but not a theologian, so sometimes I may not be able to answer a question. Yes, there will definitely be access to the slides after the presentation. I may have to defer on some questions because I don't know, but I'll do my best to help you find the answers you need. And I'm not just speaking for myself. I did this presentation with some Muslim friends and also an Orthodox Jewish friend who advises us. Inevitably, library conferences are on Saturdays, so she can never go, but we take her ideas and we incorporate them. And they themselves are members of diverse communities too. So even though they are faithful practitioners of their faith, how they practice may be different from the Muslims in your area, the Orthodox Jews in your area. What we say about Christians may be different for the Christians in your area. That happens. So you really have to let the community be your guide. But the idea here is I give you some ideas that can help you understand what questions to ask. So who is a conservative? And this was something that the three of us were kicking around an awful lot as to why we had to use the term conservative. Because in the United States, conservatives has very specific baggage associated with it. But there isn't really a better term, because a conservative wants to keep things the way they are for right now. That is what a conservative is. And it doesn't mean that new ideas are bad. It just means they want to truly vet them before they're ready to accept them. As such, a conservative, for the purposes of the presentation, is anybody who prefers not to read about certain topics that are considered controversial for any reason. And often it is a religious perspective, but it doesn't have to be. There are a lot of people who, like the girl I was talking about that I was interviewing, who was neither a gangbanger nor a migrant farmer. Yeah, she was Catholic, but her Catholicism was not the reason she didn't want to read those books. She just wasn't interested. They were not part of her reality. So it may not be a religious perspective, but often it's easier to see if you look at it from a religious perspective and then extend it out to the secular, because it's easier to see the religious perspective. This person's family may or may not vote conservatively. There are plenty of conservative readers who vote for liberal candidates, so they don't necessarily have to go together. Some of you probably live in communities where they do go together. The conservatives vote conservatively, but some of you may live in communities where the conservatives vote for liberals. I mean, it's kind of confusing when you're first getting started, but as you get to know the people, you understand that they don't always go together. So the big thing to keep in mind is, as a conservative child becomes a tween and a teen, as they get older, some of them will continue to hold on to their family values very strongly. And so they will be able to articulate to you the religious perspective for why they don't want to read certain books. And they take them at their word. They seriously do not want to read other things. But as you know, there are other kids who, when they get into the teenage years, who want to branch out. Let the person, your patron in front of you, be your guide. Not their parents, not their rabbi, their whoever it is who's giving them religious instruction. The person in front of you is the person you're serving. Let them sort out whatever they're going to sort out with their parents. So my perspective is, and this is what usually relaxes librarians, it's about what your patron wants. And a lot of these children, teen and tweens, can articulate that they want these things for themselves. So what are we talking about? We'll talk about what the potential barriers are, easy tips to help you get started. We'll work through a scenario together, talk about leading book discussions, and there'll be time for questions, answers, and resources. Okay, so what are the barriers? Nobody talks about these things in library school. They just assume that everybody is the same kind of a traditional child or a traditional teen. And as you all know, once you get out in the real world, nobody's the traditional child or the traditional teen. There are a few things that a lot of kids like the same, but there's so many things that are different. So what are the big pitfalls? One of them, if you're going to recommend the first book as you're getting to know somebody, stay away from anything with a boy-girl relationship, or more broadly, stay away from the school stories. This is why. It's easy to see, probably, in the young adult sections, boy-girl relationships usually end in areas that your conservative families are not interested in them going in, right? But even with children's books, you can run into trouble. One of the more recent, in fact, it might be the most recent Andrew Clement's book, involved mapping out relationships in the class. And Beth mentioned that in her home, that book would not be considered acceptable because boys and girls do not have a relationship. And it kind of threw me for a minute because there's no kissing, there's no sex, there's none of that stuff, but boys and girls don't have a relationship. And so that really knocks out the entire school story genre as a first recommender. But that makes it easy. Don't recommend a school story as your first book out of the gate because in all likelihood there will be boy-girl relationships, and until you figure out the permutations and combinations of a reader's interest, because it's better to just go ahead and skip that kind. Bad influences can be a problem. So if you have a book where it's funny, but the bad kid does not get reformed, like The Boy Who Cried Wolf and nothing bad happens to him, probably not a good starter book, because a lot of times they want, at least the parents, when you're starting to talk about children, and then when you move into teenage, there are natural consequences that should occur in the book, and if they don't, that can be problematic because that means this child, this teen, is a bad influence. So don't start with that kind of a book. Language. We talked about this at the beginning. Language can be very tricky because sometimes kids especially will come in and say, I can't read a book with bad language. And you're like, okay, what does that mean? And you can't get into the litany of what are the words you can't see. But know that language can be broader than profanity. For example, in Orthodox Jewish families, we don't call kids names like dummy, stupid, things like that. That's language. So that's, again, why school stories can be problematic, because often that kind of behavior takes place. It's not profanity, but it is considered bad language for some families. Also, violence. Violence is an interesting category because there's a difference for many conservative families about violence in wartime, like historical fiction violence, and modern terrorist/gang violence. So the same family that picks up Johnny Tremain and insists that they have to read it may not allow you to give them something that includes contemporary violence. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind. Is it historical violence? Is it modern violence? If it's historical, you just mention it. By the way, this is a war story. If they like war stories, they'll get it anyway. And finally, the young adult section. And you can tell when you look at the list of pitfalls why the young adult section can be a problem, because all of these things occur in the young adult section, and they occur at such a significant rate, so to speak, that it gets very difficult for tweens and teens to figure out which books are safe for them, because their worldview does not include boy-girl relationships, bad influences, language, violence. So the books don't fit. But as we all know, there are plenty of books in the young adult section that are just fine. It's just hard to find them for them. This is the big picture thing, and when my friend Beth said this, it was the most useful thing I could tell I'd ever heard explaining what happens in a conservative religious household. Her philosophy, and the philosophy shared by many people in her congregation, was this: no book comes into the house that we cannot all read. So think about it. That's often the philosophy we have about the children's section, too, that if we have something controversial, there are some libraries, maybe not everybody here, but there are some libraries where they will move it somewhere else because no book in this place is not something anybody can read. Others of us will go ahead and put them all together and not have a problem with it. But if that's your underlying philosophy, it makes it a little simpler. Do you have any hesitations about giving this book from the young adult section to a 5-year-old? She doesn't care about it, but could she access it? Could she read it if she wanted to and she could read it? If so, then that might be a good choice to give to your teen or tween who is looking for a book that's a little bit more mature but still appropriate. So are there any questions about the first bit before I move into the tips, or are they kind of straightforward? I see typing, so I'll wait a moment. I'll go ahead and let you finish typing, Catherine, and I'll kind of flip to the next one, and then I'll pause and answer. Some of it, I want to make sure not to lose time, but I know that you're still typing. So the very first tip I have for you, and this is the easy tip, and this will be a good time for a question, too. If you don't know what you have, it's harder to recommend titles. So this is kind of like an obvious thing, but you all just finished summer reading program and you're all tired. You don't have time to read every book on your shelves. Okay. What about has to do with the paper on the American Civil War, slavery, rape, or religion? Okay. You can do a report not talking about rape and not talking about religion. Slavery is a bit tricky, but not necessarily, because the main reason for the Civil War, as many of us know, wasn't slavery. It just happened to be part of it. So you would just focus on the states' rights issue and find material that focuses on states' rights. It's something. You can do a paper with that. It may be not as much as you'd like, but it's not your paper. You know what I mean? So you kind of work with the boundaries you're given. And slavery is tricky, but it could be that they understand that there are incidents of slavery, but they don't want the violence part talked about because that's not where they are right now. So they just focus on the political issue. And yes, I know for many of us this line of conversation may be breaking our hearts, but we're not raising their children for them. And as long as the teen is not coming in alone saying, no, I actually want the books on slavery or whatever, then it's not really a problem. If the teen comes in asking for other things, give that book, give those materials to the teen. But I don't know if that helps, but focus on what the child, teen, or tween wants, but assuming that the child, teen, or tween is okay with this restriction, go at it from a political angle. There are ways around it. So let me load this kosher book list. I have this website on the slides too. You have to register for an account. You're going to love this. This is it's unofficially called the kosher book list. And all it is some parents, and it's going to be hard to see the whole thing, but you'll kind of get the sense for what it is. A couple of parents got together and pre-read everything that their kids wanted to read. So then they compiled a list to help other Jewish families. I showed this to my Muslim friends, and they said this is the most amazing thing on the planet. And this is why. it doesn't just tell you a title. It gives you a rough age group, and it tells you what, if anything, might be wrong with the book. Like, for example, and it might be a little hard it might take a while for this to load, but I wanted you to kind of see what it looked like, is not yet. That's the thing, Marcia. Think about it this way. They're not ready yet. That doesn't mean they won't be ready in the future. They're not ready yet. So, Tony Abbott's Time Surfers #1 Space Bingo. Apparently, if your kids got into Tony Abbott, there's a lot of Tony Abbott books. We don't care about this column that says okay, because we're not looking at this from an orthodox perspective necessarily. But she does break out things that could be a problem for somebody. She tells a little bit about the series in this case. She uses the term middos, which is mischief. At the beginning, they explain a lot of the terminology that you may not be familiar with. A few brief reference to a meteor crashing into the Earth 65 million years ago and killing all the dinosaurs. Quite useful if you've got young Earth and all those kinds of people wanting a book. You know that's in the book. Brief mention of a rock band. For those who do not interact with modern culture, it's mentioned. More mischief. Nagia's boy-girl relationships, but it's non-romantic. And at the beginning it explains this. And it says language, nerd and weird. Now for most people that will come into your library, after reading this, you probably don't see any objections, right? But for some of the Orthodox community, they might have concerns about these things. You see what I'm saying? So you can use this to find a few things that might be helpful without having to read everything. Here there's, mentions of Santa Claus. Useful to know if you've got a Muslim student or a Jewish student. They may not be interested in that kind of thing. So this is a resource. As you can see, it's enormous. 434 pages of various things. Goes roughly through middle school. She has a whole nother situation or a whole nother group about high school books. All right, Holocaust denial. That's an interesting one. Here is my big picture response about any particular historical thing that you're not interested in. Set it down. Set it down. Follow the child. It's a Maria Montessori thing, but it works really well for library service. If the child, teen, or tween is interested in literature on Holocaust denial, give it to them. If their parents say they are, give it to the parent. Whether or not the kid reads it, that's up to that's negotiated between them and the parent. And if your library simply doesn't have any resources, you'll probably have to show them the internet, which may be a problem if they're not internet using families. You see what I'm saying? So we don't have to always like what the patron is interested in. And it may make us bristle and say, this is nuts. But if you think about it, that's how we treat all patrons. What do they say they want? Here you go. I know it's very difficult, isn't it? There are times that you bristle, but if you treat their question with respect, when the child, teen, or tween gets a little older and has other questions, they're more likely to come to you and say, I actually want to hear the other side now. What would you recommend to me about that? But not if they think that you didn't respect them. I'll wait for people a little bit, but let me keep talking a little bit when I see more coming up. But that's basically it. You do work within the parameters as best as you can. Think right age, not stretch age. Many children, teens, and tweens read books about characters that are slightly older than them. And for this group, if you stick with the same age group or slightly younger, you're more likely, exactly, that's one of the things I was going to mention too. That Common Sense Media, there are other review sources that actually can tell you specifically what might be the problem, and then you use it to, you just say, these are the issues as I see it, and you have to leave it up to them to make the decision. So if they do come in looking for the colony information, you don't have, well, how do I put this? I have a librarian friend who mentioned the same problem, Beverly, that you're having, where the parents are afraid of the internet because they think the internet is going to kill their children. And I understand that. They sincerely believe it. So, and we're stuck because so many of us have stopped getting certain resources because a lot of our patrons will just go online anyway. So, usually if you explain the difference between an encyclopedia online, exactly, that's exactly what I was going to say, Krista. If you talk about it as a database, they understand it's not willy-nilly going out to the internet. You're going to a specific location that happens to be hosted online, but it is a database. It's no different than the Encarta CD-ROM that we used to use. It just happens to be located there. They cannot get off of it unless you let them get off of it. If they have a problem, they can sit with their child and help them navigate the database. But usually, once they understand that difference, they're okay. We have the same thing in Wisconsin where we have so many databases at the state level that are paid for that if you say you don't want to use it, it's like pulling your hair out because they're wonderful resources and they really should use them because they're not the free internet, they're databases. It's not willy-nilly throwing your child out there to the wolves, it's databases. And usually when they understand the difference, they get very excited. All this stuff for free. They don't have to buy a CD-ROM. They don't have to do any of that stuff. So, anyway, back to the stretch age thing. If you stick to the right age group for the child or teen in front of you, usually a lot of the issues will check themselves out or solve themselves out because they're filtered through the appropriate age level. And again, once you get to know them, then you can go beyond. Here's another thing that happens that we don't mean to do. Occasionally, as librarians, we create these wonderful displays of books, and often they're in the young adult section where the real problem occurs, but it might happen some other place where you think, oh, I'm going to do this wonderful display on Valentine's Day, and it's a really great idea except for one problem. Valentine's Day doesn't have significance to everybody, and in certain faiths, there's not an expectation of love and marriage being connected. For example, in Orthodox Judaism, as well as for many Muslims, there's a kind of arranged marriage. And also for conservative Christians, there's the idea of chaste dating. So if your Valentine's display, as well-meaning as it is all about love and romance, that's like saying putting a big wall in the section saying, this is clearly not for you. But let's say you have a Valentine's display that includes some books that maybe have arranged marriage or chaste dating. They're dating without anything more than kissing going on, things like that, mixed together. Then it would be easier for somebody to say, oh, those books aren't for me, but these books are. You see, that's the slight difference. Use your displays to get people in, not to accidentally push them out. Here's something that if you have the space, and now we'll all laugh because nobody has the space, if you can find a way to create an in-between section between the children's room and the young adult section, that might be a way to start getting kids to move past the children's section and not running straight to Jane Austen. For example, some of you may be of the age to remember when young adult books first started coming out, they kind of had to create a genre. So they'd take a book like A Wrinkle in Time and say, you're young adult because we don't have enough, so I'm going to put you with the young adult section. And now that we have so many young adult books, everybody's moved A Wrinkle in Time back to the children's room, for example. So you could take those middle school books like anything by Lloyd Alexander, A Wrinkle in Time, things like that. And you could put them in an in-between area that's designed to get your upper elementary, middle schoolers kind of familiar with moving out of the children's room. Such an in-between area could be inviting without necessarily going into the wide world of young adult, which, as many of your parents probably have concerns about the young adult section, they may not have the same concerns about an in-between section. And yes, they do have a lot of comic books, and some people are okay with comic books. It just depends. Before I forget, I will mention the reason they go on to Jane Austen and the like, and it sounds funny because they don't like dating and marriage. Classics are considered a different genre, like as far as acceptability. So if there's dating and romance in Jane Austen, that's okay. What's the difference? That's classic literature. Classic literature can get away with a lot of things that fun books cannot for religious families. So you might actually be able to get the Jane Austen comic to fly, possibly, because it's Jane Austen, if you point out that it is definitely the same stuff. So, as I said before, when in doubt, when you're recommending, avoid the school stories or anything about dating until you get to know their specific permutation and combinations about dating. Because, like I said, there are some people whose religions completely forbid dating, others who allow it, but only certain kinds of dating. And if you stay out of that, it makes it a lot easier. That's a good question. Does that work for you guys in some places? Because I haven't seen a lot of it done, but when I gave the talk at Yelsa, they thought it was wonderful if they had the space, because it's the middle school problem. A lot of middle schoolers may not be ready for Pretty Little Liars, but they're certainly ready for the ones that are just before that. Yeah, often the difference is basically sex, but sometimes violence is another reason. Like Robert Cormier, you have to know what you're getting into with him. Beautiful, beautiful writing. Nobody can write violence like he can. Or could, since he's been late for some time. One of the things to think about is when you're recommending, if you may have noticed that your conservative families will stick to historical fiction, fantasy, although some will avoid the fantasy because the witchcraft thing, a lot of them don't. It just depends on whether they're Christian conservative or non-Christian conservative. Because the witchcraft thing is more of a problem with Christian conservatives than anybody else. But the beauty of fantasy, mystery, adventure is they're too busy saving the kingdom to be kissing each other. So often you get out of the whole dating problem. That's probably a good way to do it too, Joretta, because you're getting them moved, and that's the good thing to get them moving around. Personally, it drives me absolutely crazy because I think everybody should read anything they want to. So sometimes there are days I'm thinking, we don't even need a children's room and a young adult room, and I get all crazy about that. And then I realize, no, in the real world where we all live, everybody who goes to school is used to leveled readers. We've all been trained that we're supposed to do step 1, step 2. So the stepping system like this actually works pretty well because that's how the schools are training kids now. So we have to work with it. So for those of you who are thinking, oh no, not further subdivisions, in the reality we live in, patrons like to be led a little bit more than they used to. And it also, in this particular case, can be helpful because of that whole young adult issue. Another point to make is that old books can be wonderful. Because sometimes the parents are already familiar with them, and also the controversies have already kind of passed through to the point where they're almost considered not controversial anymore, if that makes sense. So sometimes it's a good idea to keep your older fiction around and not deselect it simply because it's older. because for conservative families, I don't know if any of you have encountered the homeschooling dilemma, where homeschoolers will come in and want all these books that you've deselected years ago, so you have to interlibrary loan them around. And people grumble because they cost so much. And you think, and I'm thinking about this with my homeschooler mindset, but you threw it away. You had it. You got rid of it. So you had the material, and the fact that you chose to get rid of it isn't their problem. So kind of think about that. When you're getting rid of books because of space issues, be very careful with the older ones because they might continue to move if you put them on a display, for example. And that goes into the be careful what you read. Really older titles, like I just reread the other day, F. Clifford's Help, I'm a Prisoner in the Library. Consider if you live in a world where you don't watch much TV, you don't use the internet, that is your world still. And so the world of books like the F. Clifford books still exists for some of our families, in which case those books would be just as relevant today. And if you happen to still have them on your shelves, maybe do a display with them so people know that they're there and that they're generally pretty safe. So we're moving along. All these questions coming in, which is wonderful, but I want to make sure that we talk about how do you know if somebody's conservative, so to speak. Sometimes it's obvious, and they will come right up to you, as some of you have said, and inform you that if you celebrate secular holidays, you must be pagan or things like that. That I totally get. But sometimes you have to be a good detective. If you see teens that do not go into the young adult area, try to have a conversation. What's going on? See if there's a reason for it. And if so, maybe you can help them navigate which titles would be within what they would like. Do you see families coming in together, but each book is run past mom or dad first? Strike up a conversation and try to figure out what are the issues that they have with books. Because the more you know your patrons, the more you can buy books that will fit their needs. Also, and this is a big one, do you know of conservative religious families in your town that you never seem to see in the library? It's harder to find the secular ones because they don't always congregate, but the religious ones congregate. So if you know, for example, that you have a Muslim community, and this is quite common with the Muslim communities, especially if they're immigrants, they don't know how the library works. They really don't believe it's free, so there's that part. But then on top of it, they're afraid that the books might not be appropriate for them because they're not purchased with them in mind. So the more you can work with them, the more they're invited in. The more they're invited in, they're more likely to come in and use your library. Well, but they're reading. There are days that I want to read the short books too because I can read like 5 short books and then not have to read one big book. And I actually read more of the short books. We all do that. My note here about marketplace theory and disability means that if you find that there are people not using your library, you do want to find out why they're not. And this is the same thing with this. But we don't care about that. We're public librarians, right? AR level is a school level of nonsense. Something to think about. So, yep, exactly. That's why you get a lot of audiobooks. There's ways you can do it if they insist they must get their AR level, and you after you give them your lecture about, I don't care about that nonsense, but okay, fine. You're the boss. I will find you something in your AR level. Here's what you probably got to do is you got to read with your ears. If they really, really don't want to read the AR book on their level, then after you've done your ranting and raving, then help them find audiobooks like somebody mentioned. That's a good way to solve the problem because they just don't want to read at their AR level. And that way they understand, you understand their pain. You feel their pain, but you're going to help them do what they got to do. And the final tip is let youth be your guide. If you can find teens and tweens especially to tell you about what they're reading, what they're not reading, what do they want to read that your library doesn't have but they know exists, That can be valuable. If you can't find those kids or they're reluctant to talk, definitely talk to the parents, talk to the religious officials and teachers if there's teachers at religious schools. What are they using in their classrooms? Because the idea is to know what they're using so that you can get things like it. Yep, they do. They will just come in and say, I don't care what it is so long as it's this level. I feel your pain. Part of it is I know why it happens, but as many of you probably know, the studies show that AR does absolutely nothing of benefit in general for most kids. And the kids who actually succeed with AR tend to be the kids that we're going to read anyway, you know what I mean? So do the best you can. Exactly, like Catherine says, you might be able to get around it other ways. I'm going to skip the scenario because we're running low on time. It's in the slides, and you guys are all doing the talking that I needed to do. Basically, the scenario was how would you get a teen talking, but I have a feeling, based on this audience, that is not an issue. So let's go right into the book clubs. If there's time, we'll talk about it at the end. Let's say you have a book club. How do you have a book club? First thing, read the book. Exactly. It makes them hate reading because you limit what they're doing. And that's counterproductive, right? Right. Anyway, so book clubs. Pre-read it so that you're aware of what the issues are. It's not because you're not going to select it, because you could still select it even if it has issues. But then you know what they are, and you can warn. You can say, okay, so there's a romance scene here, but otherwise I didn't see anything of problem that might come up. And that way you can tell your conservative families, once you know their permutation and combinations of things they don't like, you can say, okay, there's bad language on these 3 pages, but if you skip that little section, you'll be good to go. You know what I mean? So if you're aware of it, you can inform them. What they choose to do with that information is up to them. They might read it anyway. That's not your deal. You're just here to inform. And again, look at the whole picture, not part of the picture. So this is a great book. There's a kissing scene, but otherwise that's it. So just let them know. And it's up to the reader to decide. And if perhaps the reader really doesn't like whatever the scene is, maybe it's too violent, maybe there's other things that trip their particular triggers, whatever they happen to be, maybe they'll leave the room when you discuss that section. Or maybe, and this is often what happens, it's really not an important scene at all, so nobody's ever going to bring it up. But if they know where it is, they can skip that part. So this is how you, for those of you who are feeling very in need of imparting wisdom on your conservative teens and tweens and such, this is how you do it. You talk in your book club about how writers have an audience in mind, and you talk about what the audience of the book is. Every time you do that, you can have them kind of break down, like, oh yeah, there's a kissing scene in this because it's for a secular audience, but despite that, and the secular audience in which this is published, this actually makes sense. Or you can read a religious book and do the same thing. You can say, okay, well, who's the audience for this book? Or who's not the audience? Because that way you're at least talking about what might be a problem for some people and giving it air and giving it voice. Because not everybody in your club will believe the same thing. And that way they have the opportunity to exchange views, which in the end, that's what your goal is of the book club. And again, don't toss the baby with the bathwater. Be liberal in your reminders. There's nothing wrong with skipping a section you don't like. And it doesn't have to be for religious reasons or conservative reasons that are secular. It could just be, I don't like this passage. It's annoying me. We all do that. And as long as kids and teens know it's safe and appropriate to abandon books because they don't like them for any reason, to skip for any reason because they don't like it, it doesn't have to matter why. But you're allowed to do that. That doesn't make you a bad reader because you skip stuff. And for some of you, you may live in a community where the test scores aren't that great. So part of your goal for the book club, partially because you want to get some funding, and if you say things like test preparation in your funding proposal perhaps, this is a way you might be able to get at that. Let's say there are some novels that you know of that are a little too controversial. You can always do passage studies. So tell your middle school and high school teachers this stuff too, where you take the novels that may be controversial and take a few chapters that aren't so problematic from them and have them read bits of it. This is a good way to get familiar with an awful lot of text so that they can do well on standardized tests. They can become conversant about the general plot of a story. They understand the style, but they don't have to read everything. Because, I mean, there's a lot of us who haven't read lots of the canon, but we are familiar with it, and this is a way to do that. That way you don't have to worry about kids who say they can't read. And finally, this is a big one. Take advantage of the classics. Classics are always held to a different standard. That's why Jane Austen is cool, but something that's like Jane Austen in the YA room suddenly is not okay. You know what I mean? The other thing is, a lot of the kids do not get the sex jokes that might be in Shakespeare or Canterbury Tales or the Arabian Nights. So they'll go right past them. Nobody has to explain anything. And definitely look in unusual places. I know Twilight gets bad later, but from what I've been told, and I have not read it because there's only so much time in a day, and I have tried. It's not my thing. I have been told, though, the first book is pretty safe. It just gets worse as it goes in terms of things that might cause a problem with readers. Same with Rick Riordan. A lot of conservative families love him until they get to a certain book where things happen they don't like anymore. If you have the first book, that way they can read it, be familiar with it, have a conversation, and it's still considered safe. That might be a way for you guys to introduce things that they might not come to on their own and kind of let it go from there, if that makes sense. Some of your conservative kids will continue reading and not even see that there's a problem with later volumes. Others may not. But it's something to think about. There's a way to get so that they can be conversant about the titles that are hot titles, so to speak, without... Yep, Ranger's Apprentice is another great one. They can be conversant. That one, I don't know. Did we run into any trouble with that, Mike? I haven't gotten that far into that you can think of. I don't know. Because a lot of them, there really isn't anything. If you stay with a fantasy, adventure, things like that, you just don't hit anything. But once in a while, like I said, the Rick Riordan runs into something that some of the families have problems with. Others don't. But that's up to them. So, we only have 10 minutes left. So, here is the final place for questions. I did not expect so much chattiness, but I'm glad about it, so I think we've probably got a lot of things. What kind of questions do you still have? What have you always wanted to know but didn't know how to ask it? One of the nice things about seminars like this is if you want to say something that you don't quite know how to ask, I'm not going to get offended, and so it makes it a little easier, if that makes sense. Sometimes when we want to talk about religion, we freak people out, and they don't know how to talk. So are there questions, suggestions, comments? I see. I see typing, so I'm just... Yeah, that's a good series. It might be helpful as you all network with each other about what works and what doesn't work to see if you can get some lists together and then maybe create sections or use that when you're creating your sections in certain things. Oh yes, the jargon. See, one of the things, and this is an issue that happens, and I didn't give my whole backstory about the history of religion and libraries and all that, is this. Historically, there was an assumption that things were from a Christian perspective, specifically a Protestant Christian perspective, and so I don't want to say there weren't these problems, but there were these problems that people just assumed the library wasn't for them. And then we went the other direction, and we kind of ignored those voices. And you know what happens when you ignore voices? They get all clustered up, and then they talk, and they think, and they get kind of cloistered. And when you start to get cloistered, you understand your jargon, and you assume that everybody else is just like you. So part of the reason I like to give these talks is this. When we accidentally, and it's truly accidentally, we accidentally suggest the library is not for you anymore, what ends up happening is, as a result of that, people cloister. When they cloister, it's an us versus them survival kind of thing going on. So that's why when they come into your library, Catherine, you get this, they don't know that you don't know it. So just do the best you can and ask questions. The more that you sound as though you're very interested in what they have to say, and you probably are interested because that will help you serve them better, the more likely they'll understand, oh, the whole, it's okay, you don't understand, that's okay, but you're trying, that's okay. You know what I mean? They do change. The family value / good values thing, it depends on what your religion defines as those values. As a buzzword, they're both tied to fundamental Protestantism, but there are Catholics who will pick them up too when they live alongside them. It's kind of interesting to watch those terms get picked up by groups that weren't using them before because they don't have a category, so they just kind of pick up things and start using them. The whole witchcraft pagan thing, a lot of that connects to the secular humanism thing, where the idea is anything where there's a world universe that isn't religious is considered secular and therefore bad, because in their worldview everything is religious, and that's okay. It makes it a lot easier. That it makes it easier for you to figure out, oh, okay, everything is religious. Well, Star Wars doesn't have an explicit mention of God, so for some Christian denominations, usually more Christian denominations, the issue is because there isn't an explicit mention of God as the source of the Force, and God wouldn't give you what looks like magic anyway, to them it's a problem. Whereas there are other Christian communities who find Star Wars extremely religious because the talk of the Force could be stand-in for God. So therefore, that's why you got to ask questions. That's the problem, Eden, and that's why you can't get a list, because in each community it's different, and that's why, here, let me move to the list. This website where you search for secular book list, that's really the best way to get started, is just having the best catalog you can of books, asking them what their issues are, and trying to tie what they're interested in with the books you have. I know that's kind of a cop-out. One of the things I can suggest, many of you, it sounds like, are experiencing trouble with what I hate to use the term fundamentalist, but that's how it's described. They're conservative Christian groups that maybe are Protestant in nature, and that makes it a little bit more tricky for me because I'm used to Catholicism, Judaism, and Muslims working with. But there are similarities in the group, and the big thing is those are the similarities, and they help a lot. I wanted to mention too the whole idea about movie reviews when you're asked for them. Definitely look for sites like the Common Sense ratings. They will give you the rundown of what might be a potential problem for somebody. And that's all you need to know. It's a potential problem for somebody. So if you do a good reference interview, you can ask the right question that'll help. Let me go back one. I forgot to give you this little bit. Remember, and this is what I want to make sure that I leave you with, these ideas, that every book its reader. For example, I had a friend who loved and gushed about Once Upon a Summer, which is by the Christian author whose name is now escaping me. I tried to read it at least 3 times. I really did not like it. I tried to read it again this summer, and I keep thinking to myself, I'm supposed to like this. I'm coming from a Christian background, but I'm coming from a Catholic Christian background. It didn't speak to me. It didn't do anything for me. But that's okay, because it did something for her. It did something for her, and it does something for an awful lot of people. She's very, very popular. That's okay. Let the child or teen or tween lead you. So if it's between the reader and his or her parents, not you, if there's problems later. Keep that in mind. You're following the child. You're serving the child. Don't take books out of the collection to please anyone. Nobody's telling you to do that. But you put books into the library if there's a problem with a collection. Because in all likelihood, there is a problem with your collection. It's nothing personal. There always is. Somebody's always, like, for example, our library across the street does not collect Catholic perspective books for teens. There's a bunch of them by Regina Doman. We got nothing. We should, but there hasn't been enough demand. I'm like the only one who knows about them. So the more you talk to patrons, the more you see what you can add. Also, read about other faiths and secular ethical perspectives, because there's a really good reason for their beliefs. You may not believe in it, but you at least understand that they have a reason. Like when I talk to my friend Beth a lot, she'll explain everything to me about Orthodox Judaism. And once I understood that the whole covering thing had to do with the fact that your soul is in there and you're showing reverence to God that created you, okay, cool. I respect that completely now. I get it. And the kids get it too. And that's the part that's hard for us, because when you're not from that faith, you equate it to brainwashing. But it's not for them. They sincerely believe it too, or they don't. And you'll find out which of the kids and teens sincerely believe it too and which don't. But the more welcoming you are, because you understand that you don't know and will ask questions, the more they'll come to you. Definitely get the word out about book clubs that respect values that they may have, and invite parents to come in and have a family book club, because that gets you out of having to be the one being the voice of authority. Because you don't know their background. But if you get the parents in there, they'll solve your whole problem that way. And the more you get to know them, the more likely you can do a kid-only book club, and you'll understand what to anticipate. But in the end, and this is a big one, and this is why religious people sometimes have trouble with libraries, we feel the need to enlighten people whether they're ready or not. Because a lot of us are teachers deep down, and we really want to do that. Don't do that. The same reason when you write a book from a religious perspective to proselytize, the kids see right through it. They don't like it, they're not ready. But if you're respectful and you're paying attention, when they're ready to ask a question, like your conservative girl says, I'm ready to learn about my body, where are the human reproduction books? You can show them. Because sooner or later, they're going to have a question only you have the answer to. But if you've been respectful and you understand, they'll come to you. So I'm hoping all this helps you. I have at the beginning of the slide my email address if you have more questions or concerns about things, but it's already time to stop. I hope this helped. In the end...
Thank you very much, Nicole.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just going to pop on and open the download box so that everybody can download your files. So just hang with me for a second while I get that up, everybody. I did just want to, while I'm doing that, here it comes. All right, there's the download box. You can just click on the name of the presentation and click the download file button right underneath it and save those slides, save Nicole's slides to your computer. Let me know if you have any issues with that. And I just want to thank Nicole from all the librarians in Kentucky for sharing your knowledge and experience with us today. And also, while I have everybody on the line, we've got a lot of youth services librarians attending this webinar today. I just wanted to, we have the summer reading conference coming up in October, so we're sort of focused on that as far as webinars for youth services. But after that's over, we've got a couple lined up. We do have a date for one of them. Krista King Oaks, our new I'm sorry, I just saw that Rachel said she can't hear. Our new youth services consultant is going to be doing a webinar on November 9th about recommended books for LGBT teens. That's going to be on October 9th. We're also going to be having one on providing services to LGBT teens, so just a broader making a welcoming environment, things like that. We don't have a date set for that one, but it is coming up this fall. So I'm going to turn it back over to Nicole for more discussion and questions, and thank you all for attending today.
Well, I guess in the end, I just want to let you all know you're all doing the right thing already if you're focusing on what the child, the teen, the tween wants. So don't think that you're doing anything wrong. Just do the best you can, because the parents can interfere, but as they get older, you get more of a sense that some of the young people really do believe what they say they believe, in which case that's cool, right? A lot of it, I know it's hard for us when we think they're parroting, but do the best you can. I don't know if anybody has anything else, but... Well, thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you, everybody. This is Charlie again. We'll stick around for a minute or so if you have any questions that pop into your head. Otherwise, you can click the X in the top right-hand corner of the screen when you're ready to exit. And I know Nicole had her contact information on the first slide of the presentation, and I'll also, make sure that's in the follow-up email, as well as Eden's list of recommended books. I'm going to send that out too. And also a link to the article. I meant to send that out before class, and I got hassled and forgot. But I'm going to send a link to the Library Journal article where we originally sort of not discovered Nicole, but heard about her for the first time and her thoughts on this issue. So I'll send a link out to that as well. So everybody have a great weekend, and thank you, and we'll see you in October at SpotCon.